The dust from the prairie winds had worn Ophelia Kincaid down to nothing but bone and grit by the time she stumbled into the trading post outside Wasco, Oregon Territory, in the spring of 1872. Her fingers were cracked and bleeding from working the rocky soil of her late father's failed homestead. Her dress hung in tatters, and her stomach had been empty for 3 days straight. She pushed through the heavy wooden door, the bell overhead announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock her desperation. The proprietor, a stout man with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down with evident distaste. Ophelia knew what she looked like, a skeleton wrapped in dirty fabric, barely 19 years old but aged beyond her years by hardship. "I need work," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. She had not spoken to another living soul in weeks, not since her father had died of fever and been buried in the hard ground behind their cabin. "Got nothing for you here," the proprietor said, turning back to his ledger. "I can clean. I can cook. I can do anything you need." "I said I got nothing." Ophelia felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She gripped the counter to steady herself, her vision swimming with dark spots. She had walked 12 miles to reach this trading post, her only hope for survival. If she returned to the homestead with nothing, she would simply lie down and wait for death to claim her as it had claimed her father. "Please," she whispered, hating the word even as it left her lips. "I have not eaten in days." The proprietor's expression did not soften. "That is not my concern. Now get out before I have you removed." The door behind her opened with force, bringing with it a gust of cool mountain air and the overwhelming presence of a man who seemed to fill the entire space with his sheer size. Ophelia turned, her hand still gripping the counter, and found herself staring at the broadest chest she had ever seen. Her gaze traveled upward, taking in the buckskin shirt stretched tight over muscles that spoke of a life spent in hard labor, the thick arms that looked capable of snapping a man in two, the tangle of dark hair that fell past his shoulders, and finally the face, weathered and hard but undeniably handsome, with eyes the color of storm clouds. "Trouble here, Morgan?" the mountain man asked, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Ophelia's chest. "No trouble, Ashton. Just sending this beggar on her way." Ashton Oakes, for that was clearly who he was based on the proprietor's greeting, shifted his gaze down to Ophelia. She saw his eyes narrow as he took in her condition, the way her dress hung on her frame, the hollow of her cheeks, the desperate hunger in her eyes. "She does not look like a beggar to me," Ashton said. "She looks like someone who needs help." "Same thing in my book," Morgan muttered. Ashton moved past Ophelia, and she caught the scent of pine and leather and something wild that she could not name. He placed a heavy hand on the counter, his presence commanding attention without any apparent effort. "Pack up supplies," he said to Morgan. "Flour, salt, bacon, coffee, beans, and whatever else a person needs to get by for a month." Morgan's eyebrows shot up. "That will cost you plenty." "Did I ask about the cost?" The proprietor shook his head and began gathering items from the shelves. Ophelia watched in stunned silence as Ashton pulled out a leather pouch and counted out coins, more money than she had seen in months. When Morgan had finished packing 2 large canvas bags, Ashton picked them up as though they weighed nothing and turned to Ophelia. "You got a horse?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. "A wagon." Another shake. He studied her for a long moment, those gray eyes seeming to see right through to her soul. Then he nodded once, as though coming to a decision. "My horse can carry the both of us and these supplies. Come on." "I cannot," Ophelia managed to say. "I do not even know you." "Name is Ashton Oakes. I live up in the mountains about 15 miles northeast of here. I trap and hunt, and I come down every few months for supplies. Now you know me. Let us go. I cannot accept charity. It is not charity if you work for it. I need someone to help me process my furs and manage my camp. You do that, and we will call it even for the supplies. Ophelia wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but her stomach chose that moment to growl so loudly that both men heard it clearly. Ashton's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "3 days ago. Some wild onions I found near the creek." He swore under his breath, set down the supply bags, and turned back to Morgan. "Give me some of that jerky and a canteen of water." Morgan complied with obvious reluctance, and Ashton pressed both into Ophelia's hands. She stared at them as though they were precious jewels, then at the man who had given them to her. "Eat slowly," he instructed. "You will make yourself sick otherwise." She tore off a piece of the jerky with her teeth and nearly wept at the taste of salt and smoke on her tongue. It was tough and required serious chewing, which was probably good because it forced her to eat slowly as Ashton had advised. She washed it down with careful sips of water, feeling each drop travel down her throat like a blessing. Ashton watched her eat, his expression unreadable, then picked up the supply bags again and jerked his head toward the door. "Come on, we have a long ride ahead of us." Ophelia followed him outside, still clutching the jerky and canteen. His horse was massive, a bay stallion with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. Ashton secured the supply bags, then turned to Ophelia. "You ever ridden before?" "A few times. We had a mule, but I had to sell it after my father died." He nodded, placed his hands around her waist, and lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. The casual display of strength made her breath catch. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grasp the reins, and Ophelia found herself enveloped in his warmth and size. She had never been this close to a man before, and certainly not one like this. "Hold on," he said, and urged the horse into a steady trot. They rode in silence for the first hour, Ophelia too overwhelmed by everything that had happened to speak, and Ashton apparently not much for conversation. She continued eating the jerky in small bites, feeling strength slowly return to her limbs. The landscape around them grew wilder as they traveled, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills and then to the foothills of the mountains. Pine trees towered overhead, and the air grew cooler and cleaner. "What happened to your father?" Ashton asked eventually, his voice close to her ear. "Fever took him 6 weeks ago. I buried him myself." "You been alone all that time?" "Yes." "Why did you not go to town sooner?" "I kept thinking I could make the homestead work. My father spent everything we had on that land. I thought I owed it to him to try." She paused, then added bitterly, "But the soil is more rock than earth, and I am not strong enough to work it properly. I finally accepted that I would die if I stayed. That took courage to admit defeat and seek help. It felt like cowardice. It was survival. There is no shame in that." They rode on, climbing higher into the mountains. Ophelia had never been this far from the homestead, and despite her exhaustion and fear of the unknown, she found herself awed by the beauty surrounding them. Eagles soared overhead, and deer watched them pass from the cover of the trees. A creek babbled somewhere nearby, the sound of it like music after the dry silence of the prairie. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 5 years. Came out west after the war, did not have the stomach for civilized life anymore." "You fought for the Union." "Saw things no man should see. Up here, the only fighting is for survival, and that is a kind of battle I can understand." Ophelia heard the pain in his voice and did not press further. She knew many men had come west to escape the ghosts of that terrible war. Her own father had been one of them, though he had never spoken much about his experiences. The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached Ashton's camp. It was more substantial than Ophelia had expected. A solid log cabin set in a clearing with a shed for the horse, a smokehouse, and various racks for stretching furs. The cabin itself was well built, with a stone chimney and shuttered windows. It spoke of permanence, of a man who intended to stay. Ashton dismounted and reached up to help Ophelia down. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet touched the ground, stiff from the long ride and still weak from hunger. He steadied her with those massive hands, holding her upright until she found her balance. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded and began unloading the supplies. Ophelia watched him work, mesmerized by the easy strength with which he moved. His muscles flexed beneath his shirt with each motion, his long hair falling forward to obscure his face. He was the most physically powerful man she had ever encountered, and yet he had shown her nothing but kindness. "Come inside," he said, carrying the bags toward the cabin. "I will get a fire going and make us some food." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed frame strung with rope and covered in furs, and shelves lined with various supplies and equipment. It was a masculine space, lacking any decorative touches, but it felt solid and safe in a way the homestead never had. Ashton built up the fire with practiced efficiency, then set about preparing a meal. Ophelia watched him work, still unable to quite believe this was happening. He moved around the cabin with quiet competence, heating water, mixing up biscuit dough, frying bacon in a cast iron skillet. The smells that filled the cabin made her stomach clench with longing. "Sit," he instructed, pointing to one of the chairs. She sat, grateful to be off her feet. Within 20 minutes, he placed a plate in front of her laden with bacon, biscuits, and beans. She stared at it, this wealth of food, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Eat," Ashton said, his voice gentle. "As much as you want." She did, forcing herself to eat slowly despite wanting to shovel it all into her mouth at once. Each bite was heaven, flavors exploding on her tongue after days of nothing. Ashton ate his own meal across from her, his eyes occasionally rising to watch her with an expression she could not quite read. When she finally set down her fork, too full to eat another bite despite having cleaned her plate, he stood and brought over a small wooden box. He set it on the table and opened it, revealing a thick, golden substance that caught the firelight. "Honey," he said. "Got it from a hive I found last fall. Been saving it." He took one of the remaining biscuits, broke it open, and drizzled honey over the steaming interior. The golden liquid pooled in the fluffy white bread, and when he handed it to her, Ophelia just stared. "I have never had honey before," she admitted. "I have heard of it, but we never had money for such things." Ashton's expression shifted, something like sadness crossing his features. "Try it." She bit into the biscuit, and the taste that flooded her mouth was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Sweet, so impossibly sweet, with a complexity of flavor that made her close her eyes in pure bliss. It was as though someone had captured sunshine and turned it into something edible. "Oh," she breathed, opening her eyes to find Ashton watching her intently. "Oh, that is wonderful." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing the handsome man beneath the weathered exterior. "Sweetness is good," he said. "Everyone should have a little sweetness in their life." Ophelia finished the honey-covered biscuit slowly, savoring each bite, licking the last traces of golden sweetness from her fingers. When she was done, Ashton cleared the dishes and heated more water. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will sleep on the floor. I cannot take your bed. You can and you will. You need proper rest to recover your strength. Where will you sleep? I have blankets and furs. I will be comfortable enough by the fire." Ophelia wanted to argue, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves now that her belly was full. Ashton poured the heated water into a basin and set it near the bed along with a cloth. "You can wash up before you sleep. I will step outside to check on the horse and give you privacy." He left before she could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. Ophelia stood on shaky legs and approached the basin, stripping off her tattered dress with relief. She had not had the opportunity to wash properly in weeks, and the warm water felt like another incredible luxury. She scrubbed away layers of dirt and sweat, watching the water turn gray, feeling almost human again. There was a clean shirt draped over the end of the bed, one of Ashton's by the size of it. She pulled it on, and it fell nearly to her knees, the shoulders hanging off her thin frame. But it was clean and soft from wear, and it smelled like him, like pine and leather and man. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, combing her fingers through her wet hair when Ashton knocked. "Can I come in?" "Yes." He entered, his eyes going to her immediately. Something flickered in his gaze as he took in the sight of her wearing his shirt, but it was gone before she could identify it. "You look better," he said. "I feel better. Thank you for everything. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "You can repay it by getting strong again and helping me with the work. That is all I ask." He spread out several thick furs near the fireplace, creating a makeshift bed, then added blankets on top. Despite what he had said, it did not look particularly comfortable, and Ophelia felt another wave of guilt for displacing him. "Get some sleep," he said, settling onto his makeshift bed without complaint. "Tomorrow we will figure out what work needs doing." Ophelia slipped beneath the furs on the bed, her body sinking into the softness of them. She had been sleeping on hard ground for weeks, and this felt like the height of luxury. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and through half-closed eyes she watched Ashton shift to find a comfortable position. "Ashton," she said softly. "Yeah. Why did you help me? You do not know anything about me. I could be anyone." There was a long silence, and then his deep voice rumbled through the darkness. "Because I know what it is like to be desperate and alone, and because no one should have to face this world without help when help can be given." Ophelia felt tears slide down her temples, soaking into her hair. "Thank you," she whispered. His only response was a soft grunt, but she thought she heard understanding in it. She closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, the first peaceful rest she had known in longer than she could remember. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. Her body ached in 1,000 places, stiff from the long ride and from weeks of malnutrition, but it was a manageable pain rather than the desperate weakness that had plagued her before. She sat up slowly, orienting herself in the unfamiliar space. Ashton was at the stove, his back to her, preparing breakfast. He had tied his long hair back with a strip of leather, revealing the strong column of his neck. Even performing a simple domestic task, there was something undeniably masculine and powerful about him. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee is ready if you want some." Ophelia slid out of bed, still wearing his oversized shirt, and padded across the floor to the table. There was a tin cup waiting, and she poured coffee from the pot, wrapping her hands around the warm metal and breathing in the rich aroma. "How do you feel?" Ashton asked, turning to face her with a plate of eggs and more bacon. "Better. Still weak, but better." He nodded and set the plate in front of her, then prepared one for himself. They ate in companionable silence, and Ophelia marveled at how comfortable she felt with this man despite knowing him less than a day. There was something solid and trustworthy about him, a steadiness that put her at ease. After breakfast, Ashton showed her around the property. The shed held not only his horse but also various tools and equipment for trapping and hunting. The smokehouse had several racks of jerky and fish. Behind the cabin was a small garden plot, currently empty but ready for planting. "I usually do not bother with a garden," Ashton explained, "but if you are going to be here, might as well grow some vegetables, make meals more interesting." "I can do that," Ophelia said eagerly. "I am good with plants." It was the rocky soil at the homestead that defeated me, not my lack of skill. Soil here is better. Rocky still, but workable. He led her to the stretching racks, where several pelts were already laid out in various stages of processing. "This is where I could really use help," he said. "Skinning and initial prep I do myself, but scraping and treating the hides is time-consuming work. 2 people could get through twice as many pelts in the same amount of time, which means more money when I take them to trade." Ophelia examined the furs, running her fingers over the soft pelts. "I have never done this before, but I am willing to learn. I will teach you. It is not difficult, just requires patience and attention to detail." He spent the rest of the morning showing her the process, his large hands surprisingly deft as he demonstrated the proper technique. Ophelia watched carefully, then tried it herself under his guidance. Her hands were clumsy at first, but she began to get the feel of it. "Good," Ashton said, watching her work. "You are a quick learner." The praise warmed her more than it should have. She bent back to the task, determined to prove herself useful. They worked through the afternoon, Ashton patient with her mistakes and generous with his instruction. The physical labor was tiring, but it felt good to be doing something productive, to be earning her keep rather than accepting charity. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Ashton finally called a halt. "That is enough for today. You should not overdo it while you are still recovering." Ophelia straightened, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness. "I can do more. Tomorrow. Come on, I want to show you something." He led her away from the cabin, following a narrow path through the pines. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes, climbing steadily, until they emerged onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. The view took Ophelia's breath away. Rolling mountains stretched to the horizon in every direction, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring warmth. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and far below the ribbon of a river glinted gold. "I come here sometimes," Ashton said quietly, "when I need to remember why I chose this life." "It is beautiful," Ophelia breathed. "Yeah, it is." They stood in silence, watching the sun sink lower, and Ophelia felt something shift in her chest. She had spent so long just trying to survive that she had forgotten to see the beauty in the world around her. But here, standing beside this mountain of a man in this wild and beautiful place, she felt something she had not experienced in years. Hope. "Ashton," she said, not looking at him, "I need you to know that I will work hard. I will earn my place here. You will not regret helping me." "I already know that," he replied. "I am a good judge of character, Ophelia. I knew what kind of person you were the moment I saw you in that trading post." "How could you possibly know that?" "Because you did not ask for a handout. You asked for work. Because even starving and desperate, you had pride. Those are the marks of someone worth helping." She turned to look at him, this massive man with the gentle soul, and felt her heart do something strange in her chest. He met her gaze, those storm-gray eyes steady and calm, and for a moment the air between them seemed to thicken. Then Ashton cleared his throat and looked away. "We should head back. Temperature drops fast once the sun sets." They returned to the cabin, and Ophelia helped prepare dinner, falling into an easy rhythm with him in the confined space. She noticed things about him as they worked. The way he moved with economy and purpose, the quiet competence in everything he did, the occasional glances he sent her way when he thought she was not looking. After dinner, Ashton pulled out the wooden box of honey again and prepared another biscuit for her, drizzling the golden sweetness over it with care. "You do not have to keep giving me honey," Ophelia protested. "It is too precious to waste on me." "It is not wasted. I like seeing you enjoy it." There was something in his voice, something warm and intimate, that made Ophelia's cheeks heat. She took the biscuit and bit into it, the sweet flavor even more incredible now that the memory of starvation was not so immediate. She could appreciate the complexity of it, the way it enhanced the buttery biscuit, the way it seemed to melt on her tongue. She looked up to find Ashton watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His eyes had darkened, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite name, but that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, breaking eye contact, and stood to clear the dishes. The days fell into a pattern after that. Ophelia woke each morning to find Ashton already up, coffee brewing, breakfast cooking. They ate together, then spent the day working on various tasks around the property. He taught her to process furs, to identify useful plants in the forest, to fish in the nearby streams. She planted the garden, tended to his horse, prepared meals, and slowly regained her strength. With proper food and rest, her body began to recover. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, her arms developed lean muscle from the work, and color returned to her skin. She felt herself becoming stronger every day, more capable, more alive than she had been in months. But it was not just her body that was healing. Something in her spirit was mending too, knitting itself back together in the safety and stability of Ashton's mountain home. She laughed more, smiled more, found joy in simple things like the taste of fresh caught trout or the sight of the first shoots emerging in her garden. And always, at the end of each day, Ashton gave her honey. Sometimes on biscuits, sometimes drizzled over cornmeal mush, once even mixed into hot water with lemon to make a sweet tea when she had a sore throat. He never explained why, never made a show of it, but the ritual became something she looked forward to with an eagerness that surprised her. Weeks passed, and spring deepened into early summer. The snow disappeared from all but the highest peaks, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the days grew long and warm. Ophelia's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that added welcome variety to their meals. She took pride in her work, in her contributions to their small household, in the way Ashton's eyes lit up when he tasted her cooking or examined her progress with the furs. Because it had become their household, she realized one day. At some point, without either of them explicitly discussing it, she had stopped being a temporary worker and become something more permanent. She had a place here, a purpose, and the thought of leaving filled her with a strange panic. She was also becoming increasingly aware of Ashton as a man. The way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he worked, the rare smiles that transformed his face, the rumble of his laughter when she said something that amused him, the casual touches when he helped her with a task or steadied her on rocky ground. Each touch seemed to linger longer than necessary. Each glance held more weight than it should. She did not know if he felt the same stirring awareness, but she thought perhaps he did. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression of longing quickly shuttered. He found excuses to be near her, to brush against her in the cabin's confined space, to place his hand at the small of her back when guiding her somewhere. The tension between them built slowly, like water behind a dam, and Ophelia did not know if it would ever break or if they would both simply continue dancing around these unspoken feelings. The summer was in full bloom when Ashton announced they would be making a trip to town. He had accumulated enough furs to make the journey worthwhile, and they needed various supplies that could not be produced or foraged. "Can you ride by yourself now?" he asked. Or would you prefer to share the horse again? Ophelia thought about the feel of his arms around her, his chest at her back, his warmth surrounding her. I can ride alone if needed. Something like disappointment flickered in his eyes. There is no need. Easier to keep the furs balanced if we share the horse anyway. So once again she found herself in the saddle with Ashton behind her, his arms bracketing her body as he held the reins. But this time was different. She was stronger now, healthier, and acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. His thighs pressed against hers, his chest was solid against her back, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart. The ride to Wasco took most of the day, and they fell into easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing. Ashton told her about his childhood in Missouri, about joining the army at 18, about the friends he had lost in the war. Ophelia shared memories of her mother, who had died when she was 12, and her father, who had loved her but had been broken by his own demons. "Do you ever think about settling down properly?" Ophelia asked at one point. "Maybe in town with a real house and neighbors." "No," Ashton said firmly. "The mountains are my home now. Could not go back to living around people all the time, all that noise and crowding. Up here, a man can breathe." "Do you ever get lonely?" There was a pause, and then his arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her. "I did, before. And now I have you." The simple statement made her heart skip. She wanted to ask what he meant by it, what she was to him, but she did not quite have the courage. Instead, she leaned back slightly, letting herself rest more fully against him, and felt him relax in response. They reached Wasco as the sun was beginning to set. Ashton took his furs to the trading post, and Ophelia was grimly satisfied when Morgan's eyes went wide at the sight of her. She knew she looked completely different from the starving, desperate girl who had stumbled into his store months ago. She stood straighter, her dress, though still simple, was clean and mended, and her eyes were bright with health and happiness. "Miss Kincaid," Morgan said, his tone considerably more respectful. "You are looking well." "I am well," she confirmed. "Thanks to Ashton." Morgan negotiated a fair price for the furs, which Ashton accepted with a nod. He then proceeded to purchase supplies, including a bolt of fabric that he handed to Ophelia. "For making yourself some proper dresses," he said, "and whatever else you need." "Ashton, this is too much. You earned it. You have been working hard." She ran her fingers over the soft cotton, touched by the gesture. She selected thread and needles and a few other notions, then helped Ashton load the supplies. As they worked, she noticed several women watching them with curious eyes, whispering to each other behind their hands. "Pay them no mind," Ashton said quietly. "Small-town folk love to gossip. They probably think poorly of me living alone with you in the mountains." Does it matter what they think? Ophelia considered this. No, she realized, it does not. He smiled at her, one of those rare, transformative smiles that made her pulse race. Good. They stayed the night at the small boarding house, Ashton paying for 2 separate rooms despite the expense. Ophelia appreciated his respect for her reputation. Even as part of her wished, they did not have to sleep in separate spaces. She had grown so accustomed to his presence in the cabin that the boarding house room felt empty and cold without him. In the morning, they began the journey back to the mountains. Ophelia settled into the saddle with a sense of relief, eager to return to what had become home. The town was loud and crowded and smelled of horses and unwashed bodies. She understood now why Ashton preferred the clean silence of the wilderness. "Did you get what you needed?" Ashton asked as they rode. "Yes, the fabric will make 2 good dresses, maybe 3 if I am careful with the cutting." "Get yourself something pretty. You deserve pretty things." "I have no need for pretty things in the mountains." "Maybe not need, But one is important too. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and then Ashton spoke again, his voice thoughtful. Ophelia, I have been thinking about your situation, about what happens when winter comes. Her stomach clenched with sudden fear. Are you sending me away? What? No, that is not what I meant at all. His arms tightened around her reassuringly. I meant that we should probably make things proper, legal. Legal, I am asking you to marry me. Ophelia's breath caught in her throat. She twisted in the saddle to look at him, nearly causing them both to lose balance. His face was serious, those gray eyes searching hers. You want to marry me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I do. I know I am not much to look at and I live rough, but I can provide for you. I can keep you safe, and He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I have grown more than fond of you, more than I thought possible. Ashton, you are everything to look at, Ophelia said fiercely. You are the strongest, kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. But do you truly want to marry me, or do you just feel obligated because I have been living with you? I want to marry you, he said firmly. I have wanted it for weeks now, but I was afraid to ask, afraid you would say no. Afraid you might want something different than a life in the mountains with a rough man like me. I do not want anything different, Ophelia said, tears springing to her eyes. I love the mountains. I love our cabin and our life there. And I love you. She had not meant to say it, the words spilling out before she could stop them, but once they were out there, she realized they were true. Somewhere between the trading post and now, between starvation and honey, she had fallen completely in love with this mountain man. Ashton's expression transformed, wonder and joy flooding his features. He pulled the horse to a stop, dismounted, and reached up to lift her down. Before her feet had fully touched the ground, his mouth was on hers. The kiss was everything she had never known to dream of, fierce and tender all at once, tasting of coffee and possibility. His massive arms wrapped around her, lifting her against his chest, and she clutched his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath her fingers. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ashton rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. From the moment I saw you in that trading post, so fierce and proud despite your desperation, something in me recognized something in you. I knew you were meant to be mine. Then yes, Ophelia said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent, as though she were something precious and fragile despite the strength she had gained. When they finally climbed back on the horse, Ophelia's whole body thrummed with happiness and anticipation. They returned to Wasco the following week, this time to visit the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. He was an elderly man with kind eyes who asked them no uncomfortable questions about their living situation, simply joined their hands and spoke the words that made them husband and wife. Ophelia wore one of her new dresses, made from the fabric Ashton had bought her, in a soft blue that he said matched her eyes. She had no ring, but Ashton had fashioned a bracelet from braided leather and beads he had traded for, and he fastened it around her wrist with gentle care. With this, I thee wed, he said softly, and Ophelia felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. They were Mr. and Mrs. Ashton Oakes now, legally bound, though the truth was they had been bound in all the ways that mattered long before the preacher spoke his words. The ride back to the mountains felt different this time, charged with new possibility. Ophelia was acutely aware that she was now Ashton's wife in every sense of the word, that the sleeping arrangements in the cabin would change, that her life was about to transform in ways both thrilling and terrifying. When they reached the cabin, Ashton dismounted and lifted her down, but instead of setting her on her feet, He carried her to the door, kicking it open and stepping inside with her in his arms. "Threshold," he explained with a slight smile. "It is tradition." He set her down gently, and for a moment they simply stood there, facing each other in the cabin that was now fully theirs together. The air seemed thick with unspoken need and nervous anticipation. "Ophelia," Ashton said, his voice low and rough. "If you need time, if you are not ready, I can wait. I will not rush you." In answer, Ophelia stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart thundering beneath her palms. "I am ready. I want this. I want you." Something primal flashed in his eyes, and then he was kissing her, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her against the solid wall of his body. She responded with equal fervor, all the weeks of denied longing pouring out in desperate kisses and roaming hands. Ashton pulled back long enough to look at her, his eyes dark with desire but still questioning. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." He lifted her again, carrying her to the bed that had once been his alone and would now be theirs to share. He laid her down on the furs with a gentleness that contradicted his size and strength, and then followed her down, covering her body with his. What followed was tender and passionate, awkward in moments because Ophelia was innocent and Ashton, for all his rugged masculinity, was careful not to hurt her. He took his time, worshiping her body with his hands and mouth, whispering words of love and praise against her skin. When he finally made her fully his, Ophelia cried out, not from pain though there was some, but from the sheer rightness of it, the feeling of completion. Afterward they lay tangled together in the furs, Ashton's large body curved protectively around hers, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am perfect," Ophelia replied and meant it with every fiber of her being. The summer stretched on, golden and perfect. Ophelia had never known such happiness existed. Each morning she woke in Ashton's arms. Each day was filled with purposeful work and easy companionship, and each night brought renewed discoveries of passion and tenderness. She learned the landscape of his body, the way she had learned the landscape of the mountains, every scar with its story, every plane of muscle earned through hard work. He told her things he said he had never told anyone, about the nightmares that sometimes woke him, about the guilt he carried from the war, about the loneliness that had eaten at him before she came into his life. She shared her own fears and dreams, the grief she still carried for her lost parents, the shame she had felt at failing the homestead, the terror of those final days before she had walked to town expecting to find either help or death. "You will never be that desperate again," Ashton promised her fiercely. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you have everything you need." And he did. He brought her honey from newly discovered hives, the sweet golden substance he knew she loved. He hunted and brought back fresh meat, not just for survival but cuts he thought she would particularly enjoy. He carved her a beautiful wooden comb for her hair and a set of delicate spoons for cooking. But more than material things, he gave her tenderness. For such a large and powerful man, he was incredibly gentle with her, his touches always careful, his strength used to protect rather than intimidate. He made her laugh with his dry humor, listened with genuine interest when she talked, and looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. Ophelia bloomed under this care like one of the flowers in her garden. She had never imagined a marriage could be like this, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than just duty. Every day she fell more in love with him, and every day he showed her in 100 small ways that he felt the same. As summer turned toward fall, Ashton began preparing for winter in earnest. He hunted more aggressively, smoking and preserving meat. He checked and rechecked the cabin's walls for any gaps that might let in cold air. He cut and stacked enormous quantities of firewood. "Winters are harsh up here," he explained to Ophelia. "We could be snowed in for weeks at a time. Need to make sure we have everything we need." Ophelia helped with the preparations, learning to preserve food, to prepare candles and soap, to make all the things they would need to survive the long, cold months. But she was not afraid. She knew Ashton would keep them safe, and the thought of being snowed in with him, alone in their cozy cabin, actually appealed to her. She also began to suspect something else, a secret she carried inside herself with wonder and joy. Her monthly courses had not come, and her body felt different in subtle ways. She waited until she was certain before saying anything to Ashton, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. One evening in late September, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ophelia gathered her courage. Ashton was whittling a new handle for a knife, the movements of his large hands precise and controlled. She watched him for a moment, love swelling in her chest, and then spoke. "Ashton, I have something to tell you." He looked up, immediately attentive, setting aside his work. "What is it?" "I am carrying your child." For a moment, he simply stared at her, frozen. Then his face broke into the most brilliant smile she had ever seen from him, joy radiating from every line of his body. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around despite the cramped quarters. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Ophelia laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "In the spring, I think." He set her down gently, then immediately dropped to his knees in front of her, placing his large hands carefully on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he repeated as though he could not quite believe it. "Are you happy?" Ophelia asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it. I never thought I would have this. A wife, a child, a family of my own." He looked up at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "You have given me everything, Ophelia." "You gave me everything first," she replied, running her fingers through his long hair. "You saved my life. You brought me honey when I had never known sweetness. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable." He rose and kissed her, slow and deep, a promise and a celebration all at once. The months that followed were both challenging and beautiful. Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, then gave way to the first snows of winter. Ophelia's belly began to swell with their growing child, and Ashton became even more protective than before, insisting she rest more and work less, constantly checking on her well-being. "I am not fragile," she protested when he refused to let her help stack firewood. "I know. But I am not taking any chances. You are carrying the most precious cargo in the world." Ophelia could not really argue with that logic, especially when he followed it up by preparing her a cup of honey-sweetened tea and rubbing her aching feet. The winter was indeed harsh, with snow piling up past the cabin windows and temperatures dropping so low that ice formed on the inside of the shutters. But inside their snug cabin, with the fire roaring and plenty of supplies, Ophelia had never felt safer or more content. Ashton used the long winter evenings to build furniture for the baby, a cradle that rocked smoothly, a small chest for storing clothes, tiny carved toys. His large hands, so capable of skinning animals and wielding weapons, shaped wood into objects of surprising delicacy. Ophelia sewed, creating little gowns and blankets from fabric Ashton had bought on their last trip to town and from softened deer hide. She knitted tiny socks and caps, imagining the small person who would wear them. They talked for hours, planning their future, dreaming together. Ashton wanted to expand the cabin, adding another room for the child and eventually for more children if they were blessed. Ophelia wanted to increase the size of her garden, perhaps even get a few chickens in the spring. "How many children do you want?" Ashton asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her rounded belly. "I do not know. As many as we are blessed with, I suppose. What about you?" "I always thought 4 would be good. 2 boys, 2 girls, but I will be happy with whatever we get." "4," Ophelia mused. "That is a lot of children. Too many." "No, I like the idea of a house full of life and noise, of giving our children siblings so they are never alone." "They will never be alone," Ashton said firmly, "and neither will we ever again." Christmas came, and Ashton surprised her by producing a small jar of honey that he had hidden away specially for the occasion. "I know it is your favorite," he said, almost shy. "Wanted to make sure we had some for a special day." Ophelia threw her arms around him, touched beyond words. They celebrated their first Christmas together quietly, just the 2 of them and the baby growing inside her. And it was the best Christmas Ophelia had ever known. Winter finally began to loosen its grip as February turned to March. The snow started to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the first brave shoots of new growth appeared. Ophelia's belly was enormous now, the baby active and strong, kicking at all hours. "He is going to be a fighter," Ashton said, feeling the movements under his palm. "Or she," Ophelia corrected. "Or she," he agreed with a smile. In early April, Ophelia woke in the pre-dawn darkness with a cramp low in her belly. She lay still, wondering if it was just the baby moving, but then another cramp came, stronger this time. She reached over and shook Ashton awake. "It is time," she said. Ashton was instantly alert, his eyes going wide. "Now, are you sure?" "I am sure." He leaped out of bed and began rushing around the cabin, gathering the supplies they had prepared, stoking the fire, heating water. Ophelia watched him with a mixture of amusement and love, this giant of a man suddenly anxious and fumbling. "Ashton," she said gently, "slow down. First babies take time. We have hours yet." "How do you know?" "The women at the boarding house told me when we were in town last time. They said first labors are usually long." He took a deep breath, visibly calming himself. "Right, okay, what do you need? Just you, stay with me." And he did through the long hours of labor that followed. He held her hand when the pains grew intense, rubbed her back, gave her sips of honey water for strength. He did not flinch when she screamed or when she cursed him for doing this to her. He simply stayed, solid and unwavering, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. As the sun was setting, painting the cabin walls gold, Ophelia gave a final push and their child entered the world with a lusty cry. Ashton caught the baby with shaking hands, his face transformed with wonder. "A boy," he said, his voice cracking. "We have a son." He laid the squalling infant on Ophelia's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face, feeling love crash over her like a wave. The baby had Ashton's dark hair and her blue eyes, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one. We have been waiting for you." Ashton dealt with the practical matters of birth with calm efficiency, then cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing him back in Ophelia's arms. He sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Ophelia, one finger gently touching their son's tiny hand, and Ophelia thought she had never seen him look so content. "What should we name him?" she asked. "I was thinking," Ashton said slowly, "maybe Alexander. It was my father's name. He died when I was young, but I remember him as a good man." "Alexander Oakes," Ophelia tested. "I like it. Alexander it is." Baby Alexander nursed for the first time, his small mouth finding what he needed with surprising determination. Watching him, Ophelia marveled at the reality of it all. Less than a year ago, she had been starving and alone, certain she was going to die. Now she was a wife and mother, surrounded by love, safe and warm and happier than she had ever imagined possible. "Thank you," she said to Ashton. "For what? For saving me. For loving me. For giving me all of this." Ashton leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing up here, surviving but not really living. You brought life and light into my world. You are my honey, Ophelia. You sweetened everything." Tears streamed down her face, but they were happy tears. She looked at her husband, this mountain man with the gentle soul, and then at their son sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt complete. The weeks after Alexander's birth were exhausting but joyful. Ashton was a devoted father, surprisingly comfortable with the tiny infant despite his size. He rocked Alexander when he cried, changed his cloths without complaint, and spent hours simply watching him sleep with an expression of bemused wonder. "I cannot believe something so small can be so perfect," he said one day, cradling Alexander in his massive arms. "He looks even smaller when you hold him," Ophelia observed with a smile. Spring arrived in full force, the mountains exploding with life and color. Ophelia's garden returned, more vigorous than ever, and she spent happy hours working the soil with Alexander sleeping in a basket nearby. Ashton divided his time between hunting, trapping, and helping with the endless tasks of maintaining their home. As summer approached, Ashton announced they would need to make another trip to Wasco. "Need to get supplies, and I want to show off our boy," he said with unmistakable pride. They made the journey when Alexander was 2 months old, Ophelia riding with the baby strapped securely to her chest while Ashton guided the horse. The trip took longer with frequent stops for nursing and changing, but neither of them minded. Wasco welcomed them warmly, the townspeople eager to see the baby and offer congratulations. Morgan at the trading post was particularly effusive, perhaps feeling guilty about his earlier treatment of Ophelia. "Fine-looking boy," he said, peering at Alexander. "Has his father's strong features." "And his mother's beautiful eyes," Ashton added, his arm around Ophelia's waist. They restocked supplies, and Ashton sold more furs for a good price. Before leaving, they stopped at the preacher's house, where Ashton surprised Ophelia by pulling out a small box. "I know I did not have a proper ring for our wedding," he said, "but I have been saving, and I want you to have this." Inside the box was a simple gold band, nothing fancy but solid and real. Ophelia's eyes filled with tears as Ashton slipped it onto her finger, where the braided leather bracelet still rested on her wrist. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect." On the ride home, Alexander slept peacefully against Ophelia's chest, and she leaned back into Ashton's solid warmth, feeling utterly content. This was her family, her life, everything she had never dared to dream of during those dark days on the homestead. The years that followed were full and rich. Alexander grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy who loved exploring the mountains with his father. 2 years after Alexander's birth, Ophelia gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, who had her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious gray eyes. Then came another son, Benjamin, and finally another daughter, Charlotte. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Ashton building additional rooms and a larger porch. The garden tripled in size, and they acquired chickens and eventually a milk cow. The property began to resemble a proper homestead rather than a simple trapper's camp. But through all the changes and growth, some things remained constant. Every evening after the children were in bed, Ashton and Ophelia would sit by the fire together, and he would bring out the honey. Sometimes on biscuits, sometimes in tea, sometimes just a spoonful straight from the jar. "Do you remember," Ophelia said one such evening when they had been married for 8 years, "that first night you gave me honey? I had never tasted anything so sweet." "I remember," Ashton replied, pulling her against his side. "You looked like you had been given a glimpse of heaven." "I had been. I just did not realize the heaven was not the honey itself, but what it represented. Your kindness, your care, your love. You deserved sweetness in your life. You had been through so much hardship. We both had. That is why I think we understand each other so well. We both know what it is like to be lost and alone. We both know the value of what we have built together." Ashton kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, bringing you home from that trading post. Best decision I ever made, saying yes when you asked me to marry you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, listening to the soft sounds of their children sleeping. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and strong, sheltering their family, providing for their needs. Ophelia thought back to the girl she had been, starving and desperate, certain her life was over at 19. She could never have imagined this future, this abundance of love and family and purpose. Ashton had saved her life, but more than that, he had given her a reason to live, to hope, to love. She looked at her husband, his face weathered now with age and weather but still handsome, his body still powerful despite the years. He met her gaze and smiled, that rare, transformative smile that still made her heart skip. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too. Always have, always will." As the fire crackled and the mountains stood guard, Ophelia Oakes counted her blessings. 4 beautiful children sleeping safely in their beds, a husband who loved her with his whole heart, a home that was solid and warm and filled with laughter. And honey, always honey, the sweet golden substance that had come to symbolize everything good in her life. She had never tasted sugar before that mountain man brought her honey, and in doing so, he had sweetened her whole life. Not just with the honey itself, though she still loved it dearly, but with love and security, and the knowledge that she would never be alone or hungry or desperate again. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Alexander grew into a young man much like his father, tall and strong and quiet, with a gift for tracking and hunting. Elena proved to have her mother's way with plants, and the garden flourished under her care. Benjamin was the adventurous one, always exploring, always curious. And Charlotte, the baby, had a sweetness of spirit that charmed everyone she met. When Alexander turned 18, Ashton took him on a long hunting trip, just the two of them in the high mountains. When they returned 2 weeks later, Alexander had made his first major kill, a magnificent elk, and carried himself with new confidence and maturity. "He is ready," Ashton told Ophelia that night. "Ready to make his own way in the world if he chooses, though I hope he stays close." "He will stay close," Ophelia assured him. "He loves these mountains as much as you do. I would not be surprised if he builds his own cabin nearby and starts his own family here eventually." Indeed, that is exactly what happened. Within 2 years, Alexander had found a wife, a quiet girl from Wasco named Sarah, and built a cabin half a mile from the main homestead. The 2 properties became a family compound, with the families sharing meals and work and celebrations. Elena married at 20, to a merchant from town who was willing to live part of each year in the mountains to be with his beloved. Benjamin, true to his adventurous nature, headed further west to explore California before eventually returning home, unable to stay away from the mountains that had raised him. And Charlotte, sweet Charlotte, married a blacksmith and settled in Wasco itself, though she visited often. Through it all, Ashton and Ophelia remained the bedrock of the family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They aged together, their hair graying, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and many years, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate urgency of their early days. Grandchildren arrived, filling the homestead with new life and laughter. Ashton proved to be a devoted grandfather, as patient with the little ones as he had been with his own children. He carved toys and told stories, and carried tired toddlers on his still strong shoulders. Ophelia watched him play with his grandchildren and marveled at the life they had built. This man, who had once been a lonely trapper surviving alone in the mountains, was now the patriarch of a thriving family. And she, who had once been a starving girl with no hope and no future, was now the beloved matriarch, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her dearly. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the main cabin. All 4 children were there with their spouses and children, along with friends from town and neighboring homesteads. The cabin overflowed with people and food and music, and at the center of it all sat Ashton and Ophelia, holding hands, watching the life and love they had created swirl around them. Later, after everyone had left or settled down to sleep in various corners and rooms, Ashton led Ophelia outside. They walked their familiar path to the rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, the same place he had brought her that first week she had been with him. The moon was full, bathing everything in silver light. The valley below was dotted with the lights of homesteads and distant Wasco. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanged despite the passage of 2 decades. "You remember," Ashton said, his arm around her shoulders, "the first time I brought you here. I remember thinking it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I still think that. I brought you here because I wanted you to see why I loved this place, why I chose to stay. And I understood, I still do." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Ophelia, these have been the best 20 years of my life. Every day with you has been a gift. You took a lonely, damaged man and showed him how to live again, how to love, how to be part of something bigger than himself. You did the same for me," Ophelia said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope when I had none, food when I was starving, love when I thought I was unlovable. You brought me honey when I had never known sweetness, and you have spent every day since then making my life sweet." They kissed under the moonlight, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they finally pulled apart, they stood together looking out over their valley, their world, the life they had built from nothing. "Thank you," Ashton said softly, "for saying yes all those years ago, for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not know the first thing about being a husband." "You knew everything that mattered," Ophelia replied. "You knew how to be kind. You knew how to be patient. You knew how to love." They stood together as the moon rose higher. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of love and family and purpose in the wild mountains of Oregon Territory. Behind them, their children and grandchildren slept safely in the cabin Ashton had built with his own hands. Around them, the mountains stood guard as they always had and always would. Ophelia leaned into Ashton's solid warmth and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The hardship and loss, the desperate hunger and hopelessness, the moment of grace when a mountain man had looked at a starving girl and seen someone worth saving. The honey that had been her first taste of sweetness, and the man who had continued to sweeten her life every day since. She had never known that life could be like this, so full and rich and beautiful. She had never known that love could be so steady and strong, growing deeper with each passing year. She had never known that from the ashes of loss and desperation, such joy could bloom, but she knew now. And as she stood with her husband under the stars, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created together, Ophelia Oakes was profoundly grateful for every moment, every challenge, every blessing. The honey had been just the beginning. The sweetness of her life came not from sugar or honey, but from love, from family, from the man who stood beside her now and who had stood beside her for 20 years. He had brought her honey when she had never tasted sweetness before, and in doing so, he had sweetened her whole life. And it was sweet, so very sweet, sweeter than she had ever imagined possible. As they made their way back to the cabin, hand in hand, Ashton and Ophelia talked about the future. They spoke of the grandchildren who would grow and have children of their own, of the family legacy they were building in these mountains, of growing old together surrounded by love. "I hope," Ashton said as they reached the cabin door, "that when we are very old and gray we can still sit by the fire together, and I will still bring you honey." "I hope so too," Ophelia replied, "though you know it is not really about the honey anymore. No, no. It is about what it represents. You giving me sweetness every single day. You caring enough to remember what I love. You showing me through small gestures that I matter to you." "You matter more than anything," Ashton said fiercely. "You are my whole world, Ophelia, you and our family. Everything good in my life comes from you." Inside the cabin, they could hear the soft sounds of their family sleeping, the gentle breathing of their grandchildren, the murmured conversations of their adult children settling down for the night. It was the sound of life, of love, of everything they had built together. They went inside, banked the fire for the night, and made their way to their bedroom. As they prepared for sleep, Ashton reached into the cupboard and pulled out the honey jar, just as he had done every night for 20 years. "Old habits," he said with a slight smile. Ophelia took the spoonful of honey he offered, savoring the familiar sweet taste. But she was right. It was not really about the honey anymore. It was about the ritual, the constancy, the daily reminder that she was loved and cherished. They climbed into bed, Ashton's arms coming around her as naturally as breathing. Ophelia pressed her back against his chest, fitting into the space that seemed made for her. "Good night, my love," she whispered. "Good night," he replied, his breath warm against her hair. As sleep claimed them, Ophelia's last thoughts were of gratitude and contentment. She had been given a second chance at life, and she had made the most of it. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had raised good children who were now raising good children of their own. She had built a home and a family in the wild mountains of Oregon, and it was everything she had never known to dream of. The years continued their steady march. Ashton and Ophelia grew older, their steps slower, their bodies showing the inevitable wear of time. But they remained partners in all things, working together, laughing together, facing each challenge side by side. When Ashton turned 60, his children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate. He sat in the place of honor, surrounded by 3 generations of the family he had created, and Ophelia saw him blink back tears of joy and pride. "Never thought I would have this," he told her later when they were alone. "A family, a legacy, something that will outlast me." "You have it," Ophelia assured him, "and it is beautiful." As they entered their 70s, they began to slow down even more. Ashton could no longer hunt as vigorously as he once had, though he still trapped and provided for their needs. Ophelia's garden was maintained with help from Alina and her children, but they did not mind the slowing pace. They had earned their rest, and they took pleasure in simpler things now. They spent long afternoons sitting on the porch, watching their grandchildren play. They told stories of the old days when the mountains had been wilder and less settled. They held hands and watched sunsets and counted their blessings. Through it all, the honey ritual continued. Every night, without fail, Ashton brought Ophelia honey. Some nights it was just a taste, other nights more, but the gesture never ceased. It had become so much a part of their lives that their children and grandchildren knew to ensure there was always honey in the cabin. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their family gathered again for a massive celebration. There were now great-grandchildren running around, the fourth generation of the family that had started with a starving girl and a mountain man with a kind heart. 40 years, Eleanor said during the celebration, raising her glass in toast. 40 years of love and partnership. You two are an inspiration to all of us. You have shown us what marriage should be, what family means, what love can build. Everyone cheered and drank, and Ashton and Ophelia sat together, tears streaming down their weathered faces, overwhelmed by the love surrounding them. That night, alone again, they made their way slowly to the overlook one more time. It was harder now, their joints stiff and aching, but they were determined. They wanted to stand in that special place and look out over the valley they had made their home for 4 decades. The view was as magnificent as ever, perhaps even more so because they had the perspective of time to appreciate it. They could see Alexander's homestead, and Benjamin's, and the lights of Wasco where Charlotte lived. They could see the paths they had worn through the forest with 40 years of walking. They could see their whole life spread out before them. 40 years, Ashton said softly. 40 years since I saw you in that trading post and knew I had to help you. Best day of my life, Ophelia said. Even though I did not know it at the time, I thought I was just accepting charity from a stranger. I had no idea I was meeting the man who would become my everything. 40 years since I brought you your first taste of honey, and you have been bringing me sweetness every day since. They stood together in the moonlight, 2 old people who had loved each other well, who had built something beautiful from nothing, who had sweetened each other's lives in countless ways. I would do it all again, Ashton said. Every hard winter, every struggle, every challenge. All of it just to have you by my side. As would I, Ophelia agreed. You sweetened my whole life, Ashton Oakes. From that very first taste of honey, you showed me what life could be, and you have never stopped showing me. They kissed, a soft, gentle kiss of old lovers who knew each other completely, who had no secrets left, who loved each other as wholly at 70 as they had at 20. The walk back took longer than it once had, but they did not mind. They had all the time in the world and they took it slowly, savoring each moment together. Inside the cabin, Ashton performed the nightly ritual one more time, bringing Ophelia her honey. She took it, as she had taken it thousands of times before, and smiled at him with all the love in her heart. "Thank you," she said, as she always did. "Thank you," he replied, as he always did. They climbed into bed, their bed of 40 years, and held each other as they always had. Outside, the mountains stood eternal. Inside, their family slept safely. And Ashton and Ophelia Oakes, the mountain man and the woman he had saved, drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms and in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. The honey sat on the bedside table, golden in the lamplight, a symbol of sweetness, of love, of all the years they had shared and all the years still to come. It had started with honey, that first taste of sweetness for a woman who had never known sugar, but it had become so much more. It had become a life, a family, a love story that would be told by their descendants for generations. The story of how a mountain man brought honey to a starving woman and in doing so sweetened her whole life. And how she, in return, had sweetened his, bringing light and love and purpose to a man who had been merely surviving in the mountains. Together, they had done more than survive. They had thrived, building a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And that, more than anything, was the sweetest thing of all.